Chapter 7, Part 3, Human Rights. As the authors of our textbook begin their discussion of human rights, they write, "For the past half-century, the language of human rights has dominated moral, social, and political debate in the United States and is currently receiving increased international attention." A few pages later, they conclude, "Rights-based frameworks of thinking have structured the moral debate on all contemporary ethical problems over the past half-century." The authors are informing us of something very significant here. About a half a century ago, something changed. The discussion over ethical problems, both in the United States and around the world, begin to have a different point of reference. And that point of reference was human rights. Now, ethical problems were talked about before, and the language of human rights had been around for some time in this country. The language goes back to the American Declaration of Independence. But something happened 50 years ago. And suddenly, human rights became extraordinarily important, and they became a part of the ethical conversation in a way in which they had never been a part of that conversation before. So much so that the authors declare all contemporary ethical problems include or are structured within a rights-based framework. So something happened 50 years ago, or a little before that changed the ethical conversation. Well, this invites the question, what happened? What changed? To answer that question, we're going to have to go back to the 1st of January, 1914. If you had been living in 1914, you would have been living in what has been called the cocksure era, because there was a cockiness in the air. There was an optimism that was almost unprecedented in human history. The term I'm using here, the cocksure era, comes from a Time Life book written about this particular time in human history. Well, what was it like? Well, progress was the watchword of the day, and there was a general feeling in the air that whatever problem man faced, man could solve. Many believed that war was a thing of the past, and that the world was on the verge of a golden era. Utopia, the kingdom of God on earth, was within humanity's grasp. Soon, it was generally believed, swords would be beaten into plowshares, spears would be beaten into pruning hooks, and the nations of the world would no longer lift up their swords against other nations, and war would be learned no more. Things had never been better. You can see a little picture of people enjoying themselves on a beach. It was good. So if you had been alive in 1914, if you'd been there on New Year's, you would have been very optimistic about the coming year. Things looked good. Optimism was in the air. But suddenly, that changed. In the summer of 1914, everything began to fall apart. By August, Europe was at war. And it was a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was called the Great War. And before it was over, 17 million men would lose their lives. Another 20 million were wounded. And the better part of a generation was lost. But in the United States, things continued to be good. Europe was at war, and the United States was determined to stay out of it. But eventually, the United States, almost against its will, found itself sucked into the European conflict. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, declared that the war would be a war to make the world safe for democracy. This was a different kind of war as far as America was concerned. Once Prussianism was defeated, perhaps out of the ashes of the most terrible war in human history, a new world order could be constructed, and the world would be safe for democracy. So the war was called a war to end all wars. This would be the last war. And when it was finished, when the last enemy of humanity, Prussianism, was destroyed, things would be better. Even before the Great War, Woodrow Wilson was a champion of a political philosophy known as internationalism. Internationalism is a political principle which advocates a greater political or economic cooperation among nations and peoples. Before America entered the war, Wilson became famous for trying to broker a peace in Europe based on his 10-point plan. His theory was, if the fighting can stop, we can create a new world order built upon a foundation of internationalism. And a central aspect or a central feature of this new world order would be a new world organization known as the League of Nations. The Great War finally came to an end. The League of Nations was created, and the members of the League did everything in their power to build a new world order built upon that internationalist foundation advocated by Wilson in his 10 points. Unfortunately for Wilson, he was unable to persuade his own country to be a part of the League, and many people believe that is one of the reasons the League eventually failed. But without America's participation, the nations in the League made a serious effort to create that new world order. But there were new challenges, and the League was unable to meet these challenges. The challenge was fascism. First in Italy, more famously in Germany with the rise of Adolf Hitler. You had a major fascist power in the Pacific, the Japanese Empire. And soon the world found itself in another war, even more devastating and far more costly than the Great War. This new war was called the Second World War, and we stopped referring to the Great War as the Great War, and it became known as the First World War. The Second World War dwarfed the First World War in the number of casualties. 60 million deaths, over 60 million deaths. No one knows the exact count. 22 million plus soldiers died in this war. So the casualty figures among soldiers was higher than the First World War. But the thing that is absolutely shocking, and it shocked the world, it is the number of civilian casualties. This was a war of unprecedented horror. And the world that had had such high hopes at the beginning of the century found itself almost halfway through the bloodiest century in human history. After the Second World War, the United States was in a position to redefine the world, to create a new world order. So in an effort to prevent another world war and to promote peace among the nations, the United States took the lead in establishing a replacement to the old failed League of Nations. They called it the United Nations. The United Nations would not be guided, as had been the failed League, by internationalism. It would pursue an even more ambitious agenda, globalism. Globalism is defined as the attitude or policy of placing the interests of the entire world above those of individual nations. The goal of the United Nations was to ultimately move the world away from the sort of nationalism that had played such a major role in causing the first two world wars. And of course, it was hoped that there would never be a third. The dream was that the nation state would eventually give way to a world government, the United Nations. It was recognized that to do this, the emerging government would need a constitution. This was provided by the UN Charter. It was also deemed desirable to create a Bill of Rights for this emerging world order. And to accomplish this, a commission was established, led by the widow of the late President of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the truly great women of the 20th century, and she led her commission to produce a document entitled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here you see her holding a copy of that, a Spanish copy of the Universal Declaration. It was a monumental task. It was a monumental work. And that was the event, the production of this document and its later ratification, that caused the change we talked about earlier in this lecture. Suddenly, ethics and morals would be referenced to this document produced as a result of a lot of hard work by Eleanor Roosevelt and her committee. The promotion of human rights has become a widely accepted project ever since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified. And the Declaration is now the baseline used when discussing human rights. The importance of the promotion of human rights cannot be underestimated. See, the concept of a right is a powerful thing because it allows whoever has that right to make claims on someone else. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared that every human being should, and it was hoped everyone ultimately would, enjoy the fundamental rights spelled out in the Declaration. The authors of our textbook write that although the goal of a universally accepted standard of human rights, though that goal is broadly accepted, there is still much debate about the nature and kinds of rights that individuals or groups should have. In other words, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not end the debate. It launched a conversation, but the nature of the rights that we all should have and the kinds of rights that individuals and groups should have is still a subject of much controversy. And in practice, human governments still decide the limits of human rights. If you live under a dictatorship, you have fewer rights than if you live under a representative democracy. That's unfortunately just the reality of the situation. So why the debate? Why didn't the Universal Declaration of Human Rights end the matter? After all of the nations in the UN have endorsed it. Well, here's the problem. Our authors explain it very well. Present-day theories of human rights are the product of a long history of philosophical, religious, moral, and legal thinking in the West. The assumptions do not necessarily carry over to non-Western cultures. In other words, there is a non-Western world, and the majority of the people in the world live in the non-Western world. The authors continue. The development of rights-based thinking in the West goes back to Judeo-Christian tradition and the ancient Greeks. Rights, as they are understood today, derive from the Enlightenment conception that viewed individuals as free, rational, and autonomous. Bingo, that's the problem. There is this non-Western world, and it does not share the history of the Western world. The Western world is in its judgment of right and wrong has been influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. In its philosophy, it has been heavily impacted by the great Greek philosophers and their thought. And the Enlightenment was a powerful intellectual movement. And it has shaped us so that the Western world is very different from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is the majority world. So there's the problem. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified, the UN was a much smaller organization than it is today. It had just over 60 member states, and today you have over 250 member states. And the majority of the UN is comprised of nations that are non-Western in their religious, their philosophical, and their historic background. So there's the problem. If you try to promote human rights and you are defining those rights as the things that the Western world has come to believe are basic, if the Western world had its way, this is what we would impose on the rest of the world. But you have that problem. There is a non-Western world, again, and most of the peoples of the world live in the non-Western world. The author's right. Over 1/2 of the world's population has no intimate knowledge of rights or rights-based frameworks. They do not live in right-based cultures. So from a global perspective, the first major difficulty is the problem of universality versus cultural developmental relativism. In other words, are human rights universal, or are they culturally shaped values? This takes us back to some of the discussions we've had in earlier chapters. We've talked about relativism versus absolutism. And certainly when you look at morals and ethics, the West has been headed in a different direction from the rest of the world, really since the Enlightenment. The West used to be a traditional culture too, and our morals and ethics resembled those of the rest of the world far more than they do today. But we have headed in a different direction. As Nietzsche pointed out, we have decided there is no God, and we've dispelled with the supernatural. The rest of the world is not there. In fact, only about 16.3% of the world is on the same train that the West is on. The rest of the world is traveling on a train in a different direction. And so when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was developed, it represented the pinnacle of Western thinking. But the rest of the world has some different ideas, ideas that we used to share with them. We've abandoned many of those ideas. But the Western world is looking at the rest of the world and saying, why aren't you keeping up? And the rest of the world is saying, why the hell did you change? So once again, the who says so problem rears its ugly head. Someone says, oh yeah, these are the rights that you say should be given to everyone in the world. Well, who says so? Well, modern human rights theory answers that question. The UN. The United World says so. International law says so. So the authority of the nations joined together in its declaration says so. But not everyone accepts the authority of the United Nations or accepts the pretensions of those who desire to see a united world. Many countries flaunt international law. Sadly, our country has done so itself on a number of occasions. So you see, not every society accepts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you read them, and by the way, I have the Universal Declaration linked in Canvas so that you can read them for yourself. as you do so, you will find that they are not observed by very many nations of the world in their entirety. And even our own nation does not completely buy into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the Universal Declaration isn't universal. It may be an aspiration of the Western world based on its religious and philosophical and historical traditions, but it is not the aspiration of the rest of the world. There's another problem for human rights as defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is the who's going to enforce the rules problem. You see, every day, all around the world, governments routinely violate the human rights of their citizens. Every day, nations thumb their nose at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and at the United Nations and at the very idea of globalism, this idea that everyone should be brought together and we should form a one world government. So what grounds can be cited for international intervention or the imposition of sanctions? Well, currently, there's no consensus on the issues. There's disagreement as to basic morality, right and wrong, human rights. This is the fly in the ointment of globalism. How are you going to form a world community if you cannot agree on something as basic as right and wrong? If you cannot agree on the rights that a world citizen ought to be able to enjoy no matter where they live upon the face of the earth. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was intended to be a statement of a global consensus. But it is not. At best, it is the aspiration of the West. It is the epitome of Western thinking when it comes to morality. And it's a very beautiful document from that standpoint. And I would encourage you to use the link provided and check it out for yourself. It is perhaps the highest statement that has been drafted as to what the West has come to believe about right and wrong and about human rights. But that non-Western world is a problem, and they do not agree with the West on very much, frankly. So who's going to enforce things? Well, in the UN structure, there is the Security Council, and the Security Council has the power to vote, to intervene, to level sanctions, and so forth. But there's a problem. Sometimes the members of the Security Council who have veto power, the permanent members, are the ones violating human rights. And so if you passed a resolution against them or tried to, they would veto it. And so nothing would come of it. Other times, an offending state has a powerful friend who just happens to have a permanent seat on the Security Council, and that powerful friend defends it, protects it. And so the Security Council would try to intervene to correct the human rights violations that are occurring, and that powerful nation says, we're going to exercise our veto power. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights may represent the highest aspirations of the West, but it is anything but universal. Finally, even within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have the possibility for conflict between competing rights. Just as with the ethical theory of Sir David Ross, you have prima facie duties, and the authors of our text says, what do you do when you have a conflict between one duty and another? How is that conflict resolved? Well, you have the same problem with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has a beautiful list of rights and it begins with a preamble that explains the rationale behind the theory. But it is possible that people could be standing on their rights as defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet be in conflict with someone else who is standing on a different set of rights. And there is no mechanism for resolving the conflict. Now, there is a world court that has been set up in The Hague, but it is kind of a toothless dog. It can rule on things, but it can't do anything to enforce its rules. So, what do you do when you have a conflict in our society? The right to life versus the right to choose. Which right trumps which? Or you have civil and political rights versus economic, social, or cultural rights. Which rights have the preeminence? Individual rights versus the responsibilities of citizenship. Which right trumps which responsibility? Or does responsibility trump rights? So there is a lot of work for ethicists to do. If the globalist dream is to work, philosophers are going to have to come up with something better than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It might be revered and it might be useful in the short term as a reference point, but the lack of universality is going to demand that some other system of ethics be put forward. And Dr. Thoreau attempted to do that very thing. And what we're studying here lays the groundwork for what the authors are going to try to present in the next chapter, chapter 8, as they present a theory that they believe will work where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has failed. The authors of our textbook believe that Jacques Thoreau's theory of humanitarian ethics is the answer, an ethical system that will work for most, if not all, the people of the world.